The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass when Mary first saw the woman by the creek. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, wrapped in what looked like an old horse blanket and clearly in distress. Mary had been tending cattle on his ranch for over 30 years, and in all that time he had never seen anyone quite so alone or frightened. He was a man of few words but many kindnesses, the sort of person who fixed broken fence posts without being asked and always had a pot of coffee ready for unexpected visitors. His late wife, Sarah, used to say he had the gentlest hands in 3 counties and the biggest heart in the entire state. As he approached the creek bank, Mary could see the young woman trembling not just from the cool morning air, but from something deeper. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her eyes held the kind of pain that comes from being cast out from everything familiar. When she noticed him approaching, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked as though she might run. Mary stopped a respectful distance away and removed his weathered hat. His voice when he spoke was as gentle as summer rain. "I don't mean any harm." "Miss," he said softly, "you look like you could use some help." The woman studied his face for a long moment. There was something in his expression that reminded her of her grandfather back home before everything changed. Before the whispers started and the pointing began. Before the tribal council made their decision. "My name is Running Brook," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere to go." Mary nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Well, Running Brook," he said, settling his hat back on his graying head, "I have a warm kitchen and fresh biscuits in the oven. Would you like to come up to the house?" She hesitated, and he could see the fear warring with desperate hope in her eyes. What followed was not a dramatic rescue, but something far more precious, was the simple act of one human being recognizing the fundamental worth of another. Mary led her slowly up the winding dirt path to his modest ranch house. The building itself was nothing fancy, just weathered wood and a tin roof, but it had the kind of solid permanence that spoke of generations of care. Inside, the kitchen was exactly as he had promised, warm and welcoming with the rich scent of fresh bread filling the air. He gestured to a chair at the wooden table worn smooth by countless meals and conversations. While Running Brook sat clutching the blanket around herself, Mary busied himself preparing a proper breakfast. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to care for himself, but more importantly, he moved with the kind of quiet respect that allowed her dignity even in her vulnerable state. As she ate the first real meal she had tasted in days, Running Brook began to tell her story. Not all at once, but in small pieces like a quilt being sewn together one patch at a time. She spoke of growing up in a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, and traditions stretched back generations. She had been blessed or cursed, depending on who you asked, with a body that developed differently from other women. Why, the time she reached womanhood, her figure had become the subject of constant whispers and increasingly harsh judgment. The tribal elders declared that her appearance was somehow shameful or cursed. They said it would bring bad fortune to the community. Despite her good heart and willing hands, despite her skill at weaving and her gentle way with children, the council decided she could no longer remain. They gave her one day to leave and warned that she could never return. Mary listened to all of this without interruption. His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his blue eyes filled with the kind of understanding that comes from having lived through his own share of heartbreak. When she finished speaking, a heavy silence settled over the kitchen neatly. Mary set down his cup and looked directly at her. "Running Brook," he said in his slow, measured way. "I have learned a few things in my 67 years on this earth. One of them is that the size of a person's heart matters a whole lot more than the size of anything else." Another thing I have learned is that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the very ones who hurt us most." She looked up at him with tears forming in her dark eyes. "But where can I go?" she asked. "What kind of life can someone like me have?" Mary was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Well," he said eventually, "I have been alone in this house for 3 years now since my Sarah passed. I have more space than one old rancher needs, and more work than these aging bones can handle. If you are willing, I would be honored to have you stay." "Not as hired help," he added, quickly seeing her expression, "but as family." The days that followed established a rhythm as natural as breathing. Running, Brooke proved to have a gift for the practical arts of frontier life. She could mend anything from torn clothing to broken hearts. Her bread was even better than Mary's, and she had a way with the animals that bordered on magical. The cattle seemed to sense her gentle nature, and even the most skittish horses would calm at her approach, but more than her practical skills. Running Brooke brought something to the ranch that had been missing. She brought laughter. She brought the sound of someone humming while working. She brought the warmth of shared stories in the evening and the comfort of knowing there was always someone to talk to when the loneliness grew too heavy. Mary, for his part, proved to be the kind of man she had only dreamed existed. He never made her feel ashamed or awkward. He treated her with the same respect he would show any lady regardless of her appearance or circumstances. When they went into town together, which they began doing regularly, he would introduce her simply as Miss Running Brooke, who helps me run the ranch. If anyone stared or whispered, he would position himself protectively beside her and meet any rude looks with such quiet dignity that most people simply looked away. There was one particularly difficult day when a group of traveling salesmen made crude comments as they passed the general store. Running Brooke felt the familiar shame and wanted to run back to the wagon. Instead, Mary stepped forward, placed a gentle hand on her elbow, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the dusty street. "This lady," he said, "is worth more than all of you combined. Anyone who cannot see that is missing something important in their own character." The salesmen shuffled their feet and found somewhere else to be. But it was not just Mary's protection that mattered. It was the way he saw her. To him, she was not the woman who had been cast out for her appearance. She was Running Brooke, who made the best apple pie in the territory. She was the person who sat up all night with a sick calf. She was the one who remembered that he liked his coffee strong in the morning and weak in the evening. She was the friend who listened to his stories about Sarah without jealousy and shared her own memories of happier times. As the seasons changed from summer to fall to winter, Running Brooke began to heal in ways she had not expected. The constant tension in her shoulders gradually eased. The habit of looking down when people spoke to her slowly disappeared. She began to walk with her head held high, not in defiance, but in simple acceptance of who she was. She started to see herself through Mary's eyes, as someone worthy of kindness and respect, as someone with valuable contributions to make, as someone who deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. Winter months were particularly special. Snow covered the prairie in a blanket of pristine white, and the two of them settled into the cozy rhythm of winter ranch life. Evenings were spent by the fire with Mary reading aloud from books or newspapers. While Running Brooke worked on mending or embroidery, they played simple card games and shared stories from their different worlds. Mary told her about his younger days when he first came west with nothing but determination and a borrowed horse running. Brooke shared the happier memories from her childhood, the festivals and celebrations, the wise teachings of her grandmother, the feeling of belonging somewhere. Sometimes during those long winter evenings, Mary would catch himself watching Running Brooke. As she worked, there was something about her presence that made the house feel complete again. Not in a romantic way necessarily, though he was honest enough with himself to admit that such feelings were not impossible, but in the way that some people just seemed to fit into your life as if they had always belonged. Their spring brought new challenges and new growth. The ranch work picked up, and they fell into an even more established partnership. Running, Brooke proved to have a good head for business, and began helping with the books and planning. When buyers came to look at cattle, she would often spot things that Mary missed. Her different perspective and natural intuition complemented his years of experience perfectly. Word began to spread throughout the region about the excellent condition of Mary's cattle and the fair dealing they could expect at his ranch. What people did not always realize was how much of that success was due to Running Brooke's contributions. She never sought credit for herself, but Mary made sure to give it anyway. He would tell visitors that his partner Miss Running Brooke had an eye for cattle that was better than anyone he had known. The word partner was deliberate. It reflected the reality of their relationship and accorded her the respect she deserved by the time a full year had passed since that morning by the creek Running Brooke had been transformed. Not in her appearance. She looked much the same as she always had, but in her bearing and confidence she had remembered who she was beneath all the shame and judgment. She was a woman of intelligence and kindness, a person of worth and dignity, someone who had valuable gifts to offer thee.